My beloved child. Your soulmate has been telling people that next week is simply the right time to leave. That is the sentence they have practiced because it sounds reasonable. Clean. Almost painless. A change of scenery. A chance to clear their head. A decision that has supposedly been building for a while. But when someone close to them asked a quieter question, is this really about the move? They could not answer. They looked away. Because the boxes are real. The plans are real. The leaving is real. But the reason they have been giving everyone is not. And strangely, the truth has much more to do with you than they ever intended to admit. For a while, you may have sensed a shift without understanding it. Their conversations became shorter. There were moments when they seemed fully present with you, and then suddenly distant, as though some private thought had pulled them somewhere else. Perhaps they stopped mentioning plans that once included you. Perhaps they became careful with words that used to come naturally. You noticed. Of course you noticed. But you had already learned what happened when you pushed too hard for explanations. There had been a time when every silence between you became something you tried to solve. If they withdrew, you followed emotionally. If their mood changed, you wondered what you had done. If they said, "I'm fine," while clearly carrying something heavier, you stayed nearby hoping patience would eventually earn honesty. Sometimes it did. Often it did not. Eventually, you became tired of pulling truth out of someone who seemed afraid of what truth might require from them. So this time, when the distance appeared, you did something different. You let it exist. And that frightened them more than any confrontation could have. Your soulmate expected questions. They expected you to notice the change in them and eventually ask, "What's going on?" They had even imagined the conversation. In their mind, you would press. They would resist. You would become emotional. And somehow, through that familiar dance, they would receive proof that you were still deeply attached. But the conversation never happened. Instead, you became quieter. Not cold. Not cruel. Just different. There was a moment that has been replaying in their mind ever since. They had said something about needing space. Nothing dramatic. Nothing final. Just one of those vague sentences they had used before whenever closeness began making them uncomfortable. And instead of asking what you had done wrong, you simply said, "Okay." That was all. Okay. Your soulmate remembers staring at you afterward, waiting for the rest. There was no rest. You did not negotiate. You did not remind them of what the two of you had shared. You did not ask whether somebody else was involved. You respected the distance they requested. At first, they told themselves they were relieved. This was what they wanted, wasn't it? Space. Freedom from complicated conversations. A little room to breathe. But then the room became too quiet. And without your questions filling the silence, they began hearing their own. Why had they always needed you to prove your love by chasing them? Why did closeness sometimes make them want to run, only for distance to make them desperate for reassurance? Why had they spent so much time testing whether you would stay instead of learning how to make staying feel safe for you? Those questions followed them into ordinary moments. While putting away clothes. While standing in a kitchen with a cup they had forgotten to drink from. While scrolling through old messages they had promised themselves they would stop reading. One message caught them differently. It was not romantic. That was why it hurt. You had written it during a difficult period between the two of you, when they were overwhelmed and difficult to reach. You had simply told them that they did not need to explain everything immediately, but you hoped they would stop shutting you out whenever life became heavy. At the time, they had read that message as pressure. Now they read it again and saw something else. You had not been asking them to become perfect. You had been asking them to let you stand beside them. There is a difference. And they had not understood it until you stopped asking. That was when the idea of leaving began to change. You see, the first version of their plan really was escape. They thought a different environment might make everything easier. Perhaps being somewhere else would stop them from thinking about you. Perhaps distance would reduce the strange pull they still felt whenever your name appeared. Perhaps a new routine would allow them to become someone untouched by the history between you. They convinced themselves that departure would create clarity. Then something happened. Someone who knows them well found one of the packed boxes and asked whether they were excited. Your soulmate gave the expected answer. I think I need this. The other person looked at them for a moment and said, need what? A new place, or an excuse not to deal with what happened. It irritated them. Because it landed too close to something they had been avoiding. They became defensive. They said the past was finished. They said they were not running from anyone. They said you had your life and they had theirs. Then the person asked one more question. If they called you right now and said, don't go, would you stay? Your soulmate did not answer. Not because they did not know. Because they knew immediately. And the answer scared them. Yes. A part of them would have wanted to stay. Instantly. Without thinking through whether anything between you had actually changed. Without asking whether they had learned how to communicate better. Without asking whether you could trust them again. Without asking whether love was enough to repair what fear had repeatedly damaged. One sentence from you could have undone their entire plan. That realization sat heavily inside them. Because they finally understood something uncomfortable. They had spent a long time believing that you were the one with the stronger attachment. But perhaps they had depended on your attachment more than they admitted. Your love had become a kind of emotional insurance. Even when they withdrew, some part of them assumed you would still be there. Even when they became confusing, they believed you would keep trying to understand. Even after painful conversations, they assumed there would eventually be another conversation. They never consciously decided to take you for granted. That would have been easier to recognize. Instead, it happened gradually. Your patience became normal. Your forgiveness became expected. Your presence became something they only fully noticed when it was no longer guaranteed. And now, with next week approaching, they are facing a truth they cannot pack into a box and carry away. They are not leaving because they stopped loving you. They are leaving because they are terrified that if they stay close to you exactly as they are now, they will ask you to love them through the same wounds they have still refused to address. That is the part nobody else knows. Perhaps you would have expected another explanation. Maybe you would have thought there was someone else. Maybe you would have imagined that they were bored, finished, moving on, chasing a completely different future. But the thought that has been disturbing them is almost the opposite. They are afraid they still want you too much. Not in some perfect, romantic way. in a messy way. They miss the comfort of knowing you understood their moods before they explained them. They miss how you noticed the difference between their ordinary silence and the silence that meant something was wrong. They miss the version of themselves that existed around you when they were not defending every vulnerable part of their heart. But they also remember what that closeness cost you. That memory came back through something small. They found an old photograph tucked inside something they were sorting. There was nothing extraordinary about the picture. The two of you were not dressed for an important occasion. Nobody would look at it and understand why it mattered. But your face stopped them. You were smiling. They remembered what happened shortly before that picture was taken. The two of you had argued. Not loudly. That would almost have been easier. They had withdrawn after you asked where the relationship was going, and when you tried to explain that uncertainty was wearing you down, they accused you of making everything too serious. You became quiet. Later, when the picture was taken, you smiled anyway. At the time, your soulmate thought the argument had passed. Looking at the photograph now, they noticed something they had missed. Your smile was there. But the ease was gone. And suddenly they remembered all the tiny moments when you had begun protecting yourself. You stopped sharing certain worries because you did not know whether they would respond with tenderness or distance. You became more careful about asking for reassurance. You began saying, "It's fine," more often. You did not stop loving them. You simply stopped placing every fragile part of yourself in hands that had not yet learned how to hold it. That photograph stayed on the table for a long time. And for perhaps the first time, your soulmate stopped telling the story from the perspective of what they had feared. They imagined what it might have been like for you. To love someone who could be warm one day and unreachable the next. To hear, "I care about you," but remain uncertain whether that care could survive discomfort. To keep seeing goodness in a person who still had the ability to wound you through avoidance. To wonder whether asking for consistency made you demanding. That realization did not make them hate themselves. It did something harder. It removed their excuses. Because people can hurt someone without intending to. They can love someone and still be unprepared to love them well. And regret becomes especially painful when you finally understand that the other person was not asking for the impossible. You were asking for steadiness. Honesty. The courage to remain emotionally present when the conversation became uncomfortable. Your soulmate knows now that an apology alone cannot prove they have changed. They could call you tonight and say every beautiful thing they have finally learned. They could tell you that they miss you. They could admit that they were afraid. They could say they understand now. And perhaps every word would be sincere. But sincerity and readiness are not always the same thing. That is why the real reason they may be leaving next week is so complicated. Part of them believes they need to step away from the familiar version of their life long enough to discover who they are when nobody is constantly rescuing them from their own emotional avoidance. They do not want you to become their healing place while they remain your source of uncertainty. And that realization has changed the way they think about coming back. Before, they imagined reunion as a feeling. Missing you enough. Loving you enough. Being lonely enough. Finally finding the courage to send the message. Now they understand that returning to someone requires more than longing. It requires the ability to create a different relationship from the one that was lost. There is still another part of the truth they have not admitted. They hope you will notice they're leaving. They hate that they hope this. But they do. They have imagined your reaction. They wonder whether someone will mention it to you. They wonder whether you will look at your phone, think about reaching out, and then stop yourself. They wonder whether you will feel anything at all. That last possibility is the one they cannot sit with for very long. Because while they were busy assuming your love would remain available somewhere in the background, your life continued. You learned to spend evenings without waiting for their message. You became less interested in decoding silence. You discovered that peace can feel strange at first when your nervous system has been trained by uncertainty. And gradually, the absence that once felt unbearable became something you could survive. Your soulmate sees hints of that change. It appears in the way you no longer react immediately. In the way your world seems to have expanded beyond what they are doing. In the fact that you have stopped arranging your emotional weather around theirs. They are proud of you for that. And selfishly, it scares them. A few days ago, they opened your conversation. They had typed a message before. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. This time they wrote something simple. I heard you've been doing well. Their thumb hovered over the screen. They read it several times. It sounded harmless. Too harmless. The real message underneath was much harder. I need to know whether there is still a place for me in your heart. They erased the sentence. Then they wrote. I'm leaving next week. They stared at those words longer. They imagined what you might say. Where? Why? For how long? Or perhaps just, I hope everything goes well. That polite response frightened them more than anger. Because anger would mean the wound was still alive. Politeness might mean it had become a scar. They deleted that message too. And then, for once, they did not immediately replace it with another attempt. They put the phone down. Not because they stopped caring. Because they realized something you once tried desperately to teach them. A difficult feeling does not always require immediate action. Sometimes you have to sit inside the discomfort long enough to understand what it is asking you to change. So that is what they have been doing. Sitting with it. The leaving. The love. The regret. The possibility that they may return someday and discover you no longer want what they finally became ready to offer. That possibility is painful. But they also understand that your life cannot remain suspended while they learn lessons they could have learned beside you. And strangely, this is where something inside them has softened. For the first time, they are beginning to separate loving you from possessing an outcome with you. They want another chance. Yes. They would be lying if they said otherwise. But they are slowly understanding that real care may require accepting that you get to decide what happens next. You are not a reward waiting at the end of their growth. You are a person who was affected by their choices. A person with your own healing. Your own boundaries. Your own future. And if they ever stand before you again, they know the question cannot simply be, do you still love me? The harder question will be, do you feel safe enough to know me again? That is the question they are not yet certain they have earned the right to ask. So next week may come. The bags may leave the room. The familiar surroundings may disappear behind them. People may assume they are moving towards something new. And in a way, they are. But not because they have erased you. Not because what happened meant nothing. Not because another life suddenly became more important than the one they imagined with you. They may be leaving because staying close enough to reach for you before they have truly changed would be easier than facing themselves. And for once, they do not want the easier option. There is something quietly painful about that. You once wanted them to choose you. Now they are beginning to understand that choosing you properly may first require becoming someone who no longer asks you to carry what belongs to them. Whether the road ever leads the two of you back toward one another, nobody can promise. Human hearts are not contracts. Distance changes people. Healing changes people. Sometimes love survives and becomes wiser. Sometimes it survives only as gratitude for what once mattered. Sometimes two people meet again after becoming more honest versions of themselves. And sometimes the most meaningful thing a relationship gives us is not permanence, but the moment we finally understand how we must learn to love differently. But before your soulmate closes the last box, there is one thing they have not packed. The photograph. They picked it up again. For a moment, they considered putting it away with everything else. Instead, they left it outside. Not as a promise. Not as proof that you belong together. Simply because they are no longer pretending that forgetting you is the purpose of leaving. And somewhere inside that small decision is the truth they were unable to speak when all of this began. They are not running toward a life where you never existed. They are trying, perhaps for the first time, to become capable of remembering you without turning that memory into another demand upon your heart. If they return one day, they know they cannot come back carrying only loneliness and apologies. They would have to arrive with honesty, consistency, patience, and enough humility to understand that you may listen to everything they have finally learned and still decide not to open the door. That is the risk they are beginning to accept. Because love that has matured does not say, "I changed, so now you owe me another chance." It says, "I finally understand what my choices cost you, and whatever you decide, I will not make you responsible for making my regret easier." Perhaps that is the real reason their leaving feels so different now. Next week is no longer simply an escape. It has become a boundary they are placing around the person they used to be. And while part of them wishes they had learned all of this before losing your closeness, another part understands something they could not have understood then. You were never asking them to chase you. You were asking them to meet you. There is a difference. And whether they are one room away or hundreds of miles from everything familiar, that is the truth they will carry with them. Not that you abandoned them. Not that love failed. But that love placed a mirror in front of them, and eventually they became brave enough to look. And you? You do not have to run after someone simply because they are leaving. You do not have to freeze your future simply because they may return. Whatever exists between you now deserves something neither of you managed to give it before. Truth without games. Care without fear. Space without punishment. And if another conversation ever comes, it should not begin because one person panicked at the thought of losing the other. It should begin because two people are finally capable of speaking without hiding behind silence. Until then, the road ahead belongs to both of you separately. Your soulmate may leave next week. But the surprising part is that they are no longer pretending the journey is about getting away from you. It is about facing the part of themselves that could love you deeply and still fail to know how to remain. And wherever this story eventually leads, that realization has already changed the meaning of goodbye.